Richard the Lionheart was one of the most significant kings in England's history. That doesn't mean he was one of the best, or one of the worst, but he is one of England's best-known kings, and his reign was of historical importance both at the time and over time. In this episode, we'll be looking at Richard I as king, his claim to the throne, how power was secured, and his character. We'll be considering his actions as king and the events of his reign in more detail in future episodes. Richard was the oldest surviving son of Henry II when his father died in 1189, so he had a very strong claim to the throne, but it was not guaranteed that he would be the next king. Since the Norman conquest of England 123 years before, no king of England had been succeeded by his eldest son. William the Conqueror had been succeeded not by his oldest son Robert, but by his second son, also called William, and known as William Rufus because of his red hair. When William Rufus died in a hunting accident, he was succeeded by his younger brother Henry, who became King Henry I. Henry I's son William drowned when the ship he was travelling in from Normandy to England sank in 1120, and while Henry tried to persuade the barons to accept his daughter Matilda as queen, when he died, the throne was seized by his nephew, Stephen of Blois. Matilda and her husband, Geoffrey of Anjou, fought a long civil war against Stephen for the throne, and eventually it was agreed that when Stephen died, Matilda's son would become King Henry II. Henry II knew that when he died, there could be more trouble over the crown, so he had his eldest son, also called Henry, crowned as king while he was still alive in 1170. Thereafter known as the Young King, he died 6 years before his father in 1183. When Henry II himself died in 1189, he had two surviving sons, Richard and John. Henry had made Richard Duke of Aquitaine when he was 14 years old, but shortly before his death, Henry tried to force him to give Aquitaine to John. Richard refused and joined forces with King Philip of France to attack Henry. They made a peace treaty which included Henry declaring that Richard would succeed him as king. Henry died 2 days later on the 6th of July 1189, heartbroken by the news that his favourite son John had joined Richard's side against him. Richard quickly travelled through France to Normandy, where he was installed as Duke later that month, and then England, where his coronation took place on the 3rd of September. Richard was a complex character. He could be impetuous and stubborn, arrogant and ruthless. He rebelled against his father more than once, the first time alongside his brothers Henry and Geoffrey, possibly encouraged by his mother Eleanor of Aquitaine, whom Henry had imprisoned for many years after he put their rebellion down. Some chroniclers say that he was hated by the barons of Aquitaine, but even before becoming king, he had shown great military skill and strength to ruthlessly put down any rebellions against his rule as duke. On the other hand, there was no questioning his personal bravery, always leading his armies into the thick of battle himself. This, together with his personal charisma, meant that he inspired loyalty among his barons, and especially the knights and soldiers he led. Said to be 6'5" tall and strong and athletic, he seemed to live for warfare and fighting, but was also very well educated and spoke Latin as well as French and the language of Aquitaine, Occitan. The troubadour Bertrand de Born called him Richard Okinon, Richard Yes and No, on account of his apparently being a man of few words. It is not known if he spoke English well, or even at all. Brought up in Aquitaine, Richard was steeped in the culture of southwestern France that gave birth to the notion of chivalry and the tradition of courtly love that was celebrated and spread by wandering troubadours, who earned a living by travelling from castle to castle, entertaining great nobles with poetry and music. He is credited with writing several songs and poems himself. Richard's mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, popularised this culture in the courts of the kings of France and England, whom she had married in succession. Troubadours sang of valiant knights who protected the weak and fought only for honour and glory, as well as to win the favour of an often unattainable noblewoman whose identity often had to be kept secret. Richard aspired to this image of the ideal knight celebrated by the troubadours, but he did not always live up to it. Few probably did so. Like most people of his time, Richard was intensely religious, and even before becoming king had taken the cross. In other words, sworn an oath to go on crusade to recapture Jerusalem from the Saracens. While some historians argue that crusaders were motivated purely by greed for money and land, going on crusade was a very dangerous enterprise. Richard would spend vast sums of money to fund his crusade and had no hope of ever recuperating the costs. Anyone going on crusade, from the lowliest man-at-arms to the mightiest emperor, faced personal dangers from enemies, starvation and disease on the way. And before Richard's arrival in the Holy Land, the Holy Roman Emperor himself, Frederick Barbarossa, drowned on the way. The most likely motivations for Richard's taking the cross were carrying out what he saw as his duty as a Christian king, together with the pursuit of martial glory. The name of the man who recaptured Jerusalem would live forever. Richard's crusade demonstrated both his greatest strengths and the most serious flaws in his character. He cut a swathe across the Mediterranean world on his voyage, rescuing his sister Joan from captivity in Sicily and conquering Cyprus after the island's Byzantine governor took Joan and Richard's fiancée, Berengaria of Navarre, captive. He was given a hero's welcome in Acre on his arrival, and after helping the Christian forces capture the city, he led the march on Jerusalem, defeating the Muslim leader Saladin at both Arsuf and Jaffa, leaving the way to Jerusalem open. Unfortunately, Richard was forced to agree to a truce with Saladin at this point, because he knew that although he could take Jerusalem easily, he did not have enough men to hold it for long. The reason for the shortage of manpower was partly due to the more negative sides of Richard's personality. The German forces had mostly returned home when Barbarossa died, but the remainder, under the leadership of Duke Leopold of Austria, only returned home after Richard insulted him by having his banner torn down from the walls of Acre after he dared place it alongside the banners of the kings of Jerusalem, France and England. Richard's arrogance made a dangerous enemy of Leopold, as well as depriving him of much-needed forces. The aftermath of the capture of Acre also provided the biggest blot on Richard's reputation. Over 2,000 Muslim soldiers had been captured when the city was taken, and Richard made an agreement with Saladin that they would be returned on payment of a ransom. When Saladin repeatedly delayed paying it, an increasingly impatient Richard, desperate to begin his march on Jerusalem, had them all publicly beheaded. Before Richard departed from Acre, King Philip of France also took his forces and returned home, claiming to be too ill to continue, but also having had enough of being continually overshadowed by Richard, and feeling that Richard had refused to honour agreements they had made before setting out on crusade. Richard, for his part, denied that he had broken any agreements, but his stubbornness and refusal to compromise alienated and made an enemy of Philip. As his army camped within sight of the walls of Jerusalem, Richard already knew that his brother John was conspiring with Philip to dismantle the Angevin Empire. His lands were under attack. Having made enemies in both the Byzantine and Holy Roman Empires, on his journey home, Richard had to travel secretly through their lands, but was discovered with his small band of bodyguards, captured and taken to Leopold, who handed him over to the new emperor, Henry VI. The emperor demanded a huge ransom for Richard's freedom, and vast sums had to be raised in taxation from the Angevin lands to secure his release. On his return from captivity in 1194, Richard forgave his brother John for joining with Philip against him and set about restoring the Angevin lands taken by the French king during his absence. He had all but completed the reconquest when he was struck in the shoulder by a crossbow bolt while besieging the small castle of Châlus-Chabrol in the Limousin region. Richard was killed by his own recklessness. As dusk fell on a pleasant spring evening, he decided to have a closer look at the castle's defences and decided not to put on any armour. A lucky shot from the castle walls caught him and the wound turned gangrenous. He died in his mother's arms a few days later. Historians are divided on Richard's reign. He spent only about 6 months of his 10 years as king actually in England, which has led to charges that he cared little for the country. But as king of a large empire that was under threat mainly in France, he could hardly not have spent all his time in France defending it. He is accused of caring little for the day-to-day government of his realm, but he did choose reliable men to carry this out on his behalf, and apart from a brief period where John was stirring trouble while Richard was in the Holy Land, it ran well enough. In the second half of his reign, he successfully campaigned in France to restore the lands he inherited from his father. Only 42 years old on his death, it is difficult to see him losing control of the empire the way John very quickly did in the following years. Regardless of whether you believe Richard was a good or bad king, or a good or bad son, there is no doubting that his was one of the most important reigns in English history, and during his own lifetime, he was regarded as the very model of the great medieval king.